Welcome to the fourth annual Winter Symposium with the Strategic Communication Program. Good to see you all here. I know a lot of people had challenges getting here today. The snow is still messing up the travel arrangements for people. But here we are, and we're engaging in our own collective action today, just by being here and bearing witness. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up our program director, Dr. Christine Billmeyer. Let's welcome Christine.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for being here today. We have an amazing array of students, faculty, alumni, guest speakers, panelists, student presenters, and SPS and Columbia affiliates from all over the campus. So we are here today to enjoy our fourth annual Winter Symposium. It's amazing to think that we started this actually 4 years ago when we were much smaller and we didn't know as much as we all know now. But you braved the snow and the frigid temperatures to get here, and that both delights us and inspires us. So a little bit about the topic and why we decided to choose it for this theme. We identified the topic about 9 months ago, and the idea stemmed partly from our students' desire to engage in more fruitful collective action, but still needed a framework to understand how to do it best. But we were also inspired by examples of stellar alumni who had successfully applied their strategic communication skills to causes that could only be achieved through collective action. And one of the most outstanding examples of that is our alumna Ashley All, who devised and led the successful communication campaign to preserve rights in the critical 2022 Kansas vote. Another student, Devo Probal, who is now an alum, is pursuing a doctoral degree in communication with a focus on collective action, and she is designing our new course of the same name. But as compelling as these reasons were, 9 months ago, we hadn't imagined what we were seeing now in Minneapolis and in cities across the United States, as citizens act collectively to protect each other's lives and preserve our liberties. Now, more loudly than ever, is the clarion call to action, and we are heeding it. By pursuing today's theme, we are also engaging in the university's fourth purpose, which is to merge scholarly knowledge and our distinctive intellectual capacities with groups and causes beyond the academy to bring about positive societal and global change. Furthermore, collective action is in our DNA. It's a signature element of human societies since time immemorial, and I suspect that most of you have, at different points in your lives, engaged in some form of collective action. So we hope that by bringing to this forum your own personal, professional, and intellectual interests, you will contribute to and enrich the discourse throughout the day as you explore different frameworks for collective action, see how it's utilized by different sectors, groups, and communities for diverse purposes, examine research into the efficacy of different approaches to yield desired results, learn how to leverage the power of multiple perspectives to amplify impact. And we most of all hope that you leave today's symposium greatly enriched and inspired to realize our program's mission to shape the future through strategic communication. Now, many people have acted collectively to create and to deliver today's exciting and timely program. The extraordinary Strategic Communication Program team, faculty, and students Deputy Director Charlene Petty-Iqbal, Assistant Director Ed Yanish, Instructor Sky Cleary, and our Student Assistant Ria Sanjay Deshmukh. Also, SPS's superb events team, Andy, Kira, Denise, Marika, thank you very much, and our wonderful media team led by Michael Eder, who are here doing their wonderful work today. And finally, Deputy Director and Instructor Jesse Shinto, who developed this theme fully, framing the questions that we want answers to, and marshaling an ensemble of gifted, experienced, knowledgeable speakers, panelists, and student presenters who will share with us their research, their perspectives, and their collective actions. So let me now welcome to the podium Jesse Shinto. Thank you.
Challenging the status quo takes commitment, courage, imagination, and above all, dedication to learning. Today we're here to learn about collective action as a basis for change. A recent poll found that only 50% of Americans agree that the United States is a democracy. Let me say that again. Only 50% of Americans agree that the United States is democracy. We're in desperate need of democratic renewal. And I think we're waking up to the fact that no institution is going to save us. No politician, no pundit, no religious guru, no corporate CEO, and not even the Supreme Court. Our society and even our campus has been divided for some time. And if we're going to be saved, we have to save ourselves. We'll hear more about that from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Dana R. Fisher, in just a little bit. But we have to come together to bridge the divides. And that isn't a new idea. In fact, it was present from the founding of the United States. Isn't this what the U.S. founders realized when they drafted the Constitution? Democracy is the form of government where we, the people, take responsibility for our future, where we come together to solve our collective problems. We hold our leaders accountable, and in the words of Marshall Gans, we trade individual dependency for collective power. So that's what this day is about. And we, the people in this room, have a special role to play. We've committed ourselves to communication, to solving problems and creating possibilities with words. We have the ability to use our skills to bring people together, and we're privileged to be able to speak effectively. As communicators, we use our persuasive skills to advocate for ourselves and for others. And it's time for us to take up this mantle. As Joyce Vance has observed, we, the people, are the fourth branch of government. So this Winter Symposium is devoted to strategic communication for collective action. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers, organizers who have been on the front lines, academics who study collective action, agency professionals who advise others every day. We'll learn about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, the importance of leadership structures, and the power of narratives to create new understandings and new openings for action. We'll also have a chance in our breakout sessions to develop as leaders and use our creativity for consciousness raising. In the final segment of the day, we provide a platform for current StratCom students to make a call to action. So many people who have participated in mass movements describe something special, a feeling of solidarity and civic purpose. So I hope you leave today with some new skills, some new friends, and a renewed sense of hope. No matter what happens, we have each other. and there's always strength in numbers. And now I will introduce our featured speaker. Dr. Dana R. Fisher is a professor in the School of International Service at American University. She's also the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Fisher's work focuses on democracy, civic engagement, activism, and climate policy. She's published more than 80 peer-reviewed articles and 7 books. Her most recent include Saving Ourselves, From Climate Shocks to Climate Action, and American Resistance, From the Women's March to the Blue Wave. Dr. Fisher has also delivered TED Talks and made numerous appearances, including on ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and many other networks. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's from Princeton University. And today she'll discuss how social movements and mass mobilization can give us the power to confront entrenched interests, cultivate resilience, and create meaningful change. Dr. Fisher will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. Please help me welcome Dr. Dana R. Fisher.
This thing. Okay, wait. Okay, well, you're going to have to see it go backwards. Sorry, everybody. Shh, you didn't see any of that. All right, good morning. All right, this cold is going to make me a little froggy, so I apologize about that. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a kind introduction. I don't really need to introduce myself because that was such a wonderful introduction, but just to say that, so as Jesse mentioned, so my work does focus on democracy, collective action, social movements. I've studied numerous social movements, and I've worked with a number of organizations trying to mobilize the masses during these trying times. I'm going to present some of those data today. In some ways, I think that, I study communication. I have been doing some work recently on strategic communication. I don't consider myself a strategic communicator, but maybe today's experiences will convince me otherwise. But I am doing a lot of work with organizations trying to use the data and science that I do from the social sciences to leverage and amplify voices in these trying times. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of how I do that today. So this is like the background part of the talk, where I tell you a little bit about the kinds of questions that I ask. And a really good summary of a lot of the work that I do is I'm trying to understand, what can we expect from civil society as the world warms and our democracy struggles to survive? In a lot of ways, we've started to call this a polycrisis, right? We're not just facing one crisis, but rather we're facing numerous crises simultaneously. And that means that collective action needs to happen a little bit differently. And it has to build on and expand and bring in much more solidarity than we otherwise would have expected. The comments that I'm going to make today are informed by my 2 recent books, that is American Resistance and Saving Ourselves. I believe they'll be available later today if anybody wants to buy them and I can sign them. But I'm also going to be bringing in data that I've been collecting during what we're now calling, I don't know if it's really affectionately, but we're calling right now Resistance 2.0, which is the new American resistance. And I'm going to present some data that I collected just last week at the Free America Walkout and use that to inform what we can understand, what we can think about collective action in these times. So here, just to begin with, so what is collective action? What does it mean? What does it mean when we talk about it? Here's a quote from the World Economic Forum. Collective action can be generally defined as an action or a set of actions carried out by a group of people focused on a common vision. Effective collective action has the potential to drive policy change at local, national, and international levels. So my take, though, is slightly nuanced from that. It's about efforts to bring about social change by actors working together. That's the key part. That's where it becomes collective and not individual, outside the state and market sectors of society. Now, it is true that collective action can happen within the state and the market, but most of us who look at collective action and try to think about how to affect social change tend to think of it as being driven by and motivated by civil society, which is those outside of the state and the market sector. So when we think about collective action or social movements, there are a couple different dimensions that we tend to think about and that those of us who study it tend to focus on in our research to try to understand what works and what doesn't. And so here are just some of the characteristics that we can think about when we try to understand how to communicate strategically to affect social change, right? So one of the things that is really important to understand is that there's a diversity of excuse me, organizations in organizational forms with regard to collective action. And so collective action can be motivated by individuals, but there also can be professionalized groups or collective assemblances or even these less affiliated conglomerations of individuals who are not formally connected but are working together. We're seeing that a lot in Minnesota right now in terms of these communities that are working together to push back as well as to support one another and provide mutual aid. One of the other things that we think about is what is the target of the activism? Is the goal to affect change at the state level? In the political arena, is it more about getting the economic sector to change? And that helps us to think about the scale of the target as well. Are we trying to make change here, here on the Upper West Side, here in New York City, in the state of New York, in the United States, or globally? And based on that scale, there's going to be very big differences in the types of, collective action that's necessary. You can make a big difference here on Columbia's campus or on the Upper West Side with only a couple hundred people. But you can't really make that kind of a difference if you're trying to change the Trump administration's policies, or globally for that matter. We also think about what the tactics of activism are, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that. In fact, I have a piece coming out about the shifting tactics within Resistance 2.0 at The Guardian this weekend, so you can stay tuned for that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in that piece at the end of my comments today. But when we think about tactics, there's a real range of tactics in terms of thinking about the types of tactics that we can do in our everyday lives, the types of tactics that are working through political systems or the economic system, but there are also tactics that are outside of them. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on my next slide. But then finally, when we're trying to understand collective action, we also need to understand the outcome. Now, I do a lot of media, as Jesse mentioned, and if you ask me what is the most common question you're asked in the media, by far it is that movement successful? Did it work? Why didn't it work? Something like that. It's all about the outcome, right? And what we need to understand is that different groups and different collectivities of actors are looking for really different outcomes. For example, I work some with an organization that entirely gauges the success of their actions by how many people repost them on social media. Is that the best outcome of collective action? That's a personal decision, but as somebody who studies policymaking, I would say not necessarily the best in terms of affecting social change, but if you're looking for that and you get 1 million hits in a night, congratulations, you have a successful outcome. But if you're trying to overturn, a political administration, you may need more than just hits on, social media. So those are the kinds of questions that we tend to ask and think about. I have this diagram that I developed about pathways for meaningful social change. This diagram came from work I did with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I wrote a section for the most recent assessment that was specifically on civic action and environmental change, where I basically was brought in to summarize all of the research and what we know about how collective action can be associated with reductions in CO2 emissions, which was kind of something that we don't tend to think about when you're coming from the social side, but something that was really valuable. So when I was doing the work, I came up with this diagram, and I think it's a really useful way of thinking about the different ways that we can affect social change. So some of the types of ways that we do this are what we would call direct activism. And in direct activism, you personally are changing your behaviors in some way that actually have an effect, right? And so that is where it's frequently individual, but it can be collectives, like you and a bunch of friends can decide to work together. One of the most common ways that we can think about direct activism is when we're thinking about kind of individual purchasing behaviors. We think about boycotts, and boycotts are deliberately buying certain projects, which we call boycotts, for political, ethical, or environmental reasons. Now, one of the things that my team and I do is we run a national survey once a year, and we do it the 2 weeks before the election. So the data that we collected in November 2025, which seems like at least one lifetime ago at this point, and before you all had a great new mayor, But at that time, we asked these questions of a national sample, and what I can tell you is that 30% of our national sample, so 30% of the United States, reports that they have participated in this type of direct activism. Not necessarily for the exact same goals, but they are doing this kind of activism, right? Then we have indirect activism, which is the most common way that we think about activism. And that's where you do something to pressure somebody who has the ability to change behaviors. You try to get a board to change the policies of a business. You try to get the head of a university to change their policies, and you do it using a whole range of different types of tactics with the idea that it will kind of boomerang in to change the outcome that you want, right, or affect the kind of change you want. So we can think about this as working inside as insiders within the system, and there are many different ways that folks try to do that. You can lobby, advocate, and there are many different forms of that. One of the ones that we look at a lot is people contacting elected officials, right, so that's lobbying in a lot of cases. 17% of our national sample in November said that they had done that. And then there's this outsider behavior. We're seeing a lot more of that, and we should expect to see more and more in that because a lot of the institutional channels that we have historically had in the United States to participate democratically have narrowed in the past year and a couple of days now, I guess. And so one of the big ways that we look at that is whether people attended an organized protest, march, or demonstration of any kind. So in November 2025, 10% of the American population said they did that, which is about normal and less than what we saw by the time we got to the end of the first Trump administration. I would predict that if we did the same survey in February, that number will have gone up. In fact, and I'm going to be presenting some data from the Free America walkout from last week, but the walkout is an example of this type of indirect outsider activism where people are basically removing themselves from their work as a way of sending a message, right? Or the strike that happened in Minnesota, and you may or may not know there is a strike planned today. Has anybody heard about the strike today? I'm just curious. All right, good. Anybody here planning on striking? We will not be seeing you later today, I suppose. But anyway, so all of these things come together, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all, and it's not like a one tactic is the only way to affect change. In fact, I would argue, and there's a lot of research that supports my argument, that it is actually the combinations of tactics together that can assert the kind of pressure that is necessary to affect real social change. So now that brings us to Trump's America, and here what I'm going to do is present, as I said, data that I've been collecting. As you know, I wrote this book called American Resistance back during the first Trump administration. And one of the ways that I do this is I go out in the streets with a team of researchers and we survey protesters. We do random surveys, or we do random samples of people who are participating in protests with the goal of surveying them so that we understand who's in the crowd. And I'm happy during a question and answer, people want to know why I do that or how that whole thing works. I'm happy to do that. And when I started doing this back at the beginning of this Trump administration, people were like, well, who are you and why should I talk to you? And I'm like, well, I wrote this book called American Resistance, and I thought that was the end of it, but apparently here we are again, so I'm back in the streets. So that's one of the ways that I do that. One of the other things that I've been doing more and more is I work with organizations that are coordinating these collective or coordinated days of action. Like I worked with Indivisible or with the Women's March, groups like that that are coordinating so that I can get national samples of people who are participating. So I'll be presenting two types of data. So this is basically an agglomeration of all that I've found so far. And these are some of my pictures, my favorite pictures. I've got some nasty women down at the bottom at the People's March. That was 2 days before the inauguration. And then this is a collection of all the people who are using this kind of festive, performative types of action at No King's Day 2018. Sorry, forget that 2018. I don't know where that came from. No King's Day 2, which was in October. And at that, you may, if you were involved in it, actually, anybody here participate in No King's Day? Any of them? Fewer people than know about the strike. Interesting. Okay, so at No King's Day, one of the things, there was a lot of worry that there was going to be this crackdown and people were going to be harassed even though they're participating in nonviolent, legally permitted types of collective action. So many people decided to follow the lead of the folks out in Portland who were dressing up in these funny outfits and staging protests while dressed as like dinosaurs. There were all these great videos that you probably saw of people being chased by ICE agents dressed as like dinosaurs and all this stuff. So we saw them these are some of my pictures in DC. We did have Trump there. This woman who was like a pseudo Betsy Ross over there wearing a hat. We had unicorns. We had avocados. I tried to figure out and ask the guy why he was dressed as an avocado, and he was like, this is what I could get from the store. So there you have it. But the most important thing to note here is, so who's protesting right now? I mean, people are protesting, all sorts of people are protesting, but overall, looking at all the data I've collected, like the first Women's March, participants in the resistance to Trump 2.0 are highly educated, way more educated than the national population in the United States, middle-aged or even older, white and predominantly female. They are overwhelmingly left-leaning, and they voted for Harris. In fact, over 90% of them, those people who have been in the streets at these peaceful protests, over 90% of them at every one report voting for Harris. So these are Democrats. These are Democratic voters, at least, whether or not they identify as Democrats anymore. So I just had some of my data from the walkout from last week came out in The Economist yesterday, and the journalist there presented a table of my data and called it the Daughters of Joan Baez. So I think I'm going to just like adapt that and embrace that. So the folks out in the streets, you may see a lot of them, and they are the Daughters of Joan Baez. I mean, there are lots of other people who are maybe granddaughters, even grandsons of Joan Baez who are out there too, but most of them are the daughters of Joan Baez. So what are they protesting? One of the things that we started asking during the first Trump administration was we started asking people why they were there in the crowd, which is kind of an interesting question. It actually, when we started doing this in 2017, nobody before had actually said, if you go out to a women's march, like, why are you here? Because the expectation is if you're at a women's march, you're there because you care about women's issues or reproductive rights. But so we started asking that, and one of the things that we found is there was this collectives of motivations that were bringing people out in the streets. So this is just, I circled the big find here, which is basically that across the Resistance 2.0, since January of last year, what we're seeing is the top motivation for people to come out in the streets is Trump and immigration. And this in some ways is similar and some ways different from what we saw last time around. Certainly, Trump was always a motivation since the first resistance, but immigration has gone way up. I mean, what's kind of interesting, and I think that we'll probably see this spike again, is during No King's Day 1, which was over June, that was even higher, when 87% of the people on the streets actually reported that they were out in the streets because they were worried about immigration in America. And this is like immigration rights, okay? So what else are they doing? And here I'm quoting Rachel Carmona, who is the executive director of Women's March, who she was kind enough to come on my podcast, and she basically said, we understand that protest is the floor, not the ceiling. The expectation is that people are not just going to go out in the streets, protest on a Saturday, or even, a weekday now, strike on a weekday, and go home and be like, all right, I'm done, my activism is over, and the world's going to be better because I did this one thing. The expectation is that people are going to be doing lots of different things, using both insider and outsider tactics. And what we can see here from the data are that we are seeing exactly that. People are coming out, and they're participating in protests, they're participating in the Free America Walkout, which is the column all the way to your right. But they're also contacting their elected officials. They're attending town hall meetings. They are contacting the media. They're participating in direct action, which is nonviolent civil disobedience. That's an important number here because I think that while that number was only 21% last week at the Free America Walkout, and that's based on a sample of over 7,500 activists who participated across the country, I think that number is about to spike. It's my prediction. And then 88% of these people have also decided to use their wallets to express their political views by boycotting or boycotting, right? So these are really highly civic engaged individuals. And what's worth noting here also is in comparison to a national sample, these numbers are way higher. So the people who are out in the streets are doing lots and lots more. So one of the other things that I asked when I was surveying at the Free America Walkout last week was the organization is really interested. The organization that coordinated Free America was Women's March, but they were in this coalition. And they were really interested in trying to understand what was the appetite of the people who were participating. What do they want to do? Where do they want to go? Because they recognize that protesting again and again, they just announced No King's Day 3, by the way, it's going to be in March, but doing that again and again may not be enough. And they started to feel like other things have to happen. So we added to our survey that we just completed another two questions. And the questions were about what the people who were participating were willing to do. And so we asked the questions, the first question was social movement, are you willing to do you agree that social movements should be taking more confrontational action against the Trump administration. It was really flubbed up. And what's really interesting is that there was overwhelming support for this, right? 79% of the people whom we surveyed across the country agreed that social movements need to be taking more confrontational action. And then the second question was, do you personally agree that you would be willing to participate if there were opportunities to engage in more confrontational activism? And here we see 65%, that's 65% of the daughters of Joan Baez saying that they are willing to participate in more confrontational action. That's why I say that while we only saw 21% of the people whom I surveyed saying that they had done it so far, we're going to see a lot more of that. And this confrontational action, that does not mean they're going to get violent. In fact, I would guess that most of these people are never going to get close to violent. What they are going to do is they're going to start blocking streets. They're going to start interrupting people who come to speak whose opinions they don't agree with. This is like a bird dogging or bird dogging kind of an approach, which has become really, really popular for some. They're going to be following ICE agents around and recording them, right? They're going to be supporting and escorting kids of folks who are worried about ICE agents to school. They're going to be doing a lot more of these kinds of actions that put them in, basically in the line of fire in today's America, as ridiculous as that may seem, and something I never thought I would have said, even like 6 months ago. That's the kind of confrontational action that we're going to be seeing from these people. So as we think about marching forward in 2026, here are some images. Let's see, I'll tell you about my images first. But basically, two of these images are images I took at DC where we were collecting data down at the bottom at different marches. I love this one. This was during the big Doge surge on the left. He doesn't even go here. I believe that was Elon Musk, by the way, that they were referring to. And then this is from the strike last week in Minnesota, where we saw like tens of thousands of people who were striking last Friday. And then that is an ICE agent's way of treating a peaceful protester who was standing in the street. Unfortunately, that is some of the more benign ways that ICE agents have been treating protesters who are engaging in nonviolent activism. So what do we know? We know the resistance is back. And in fact, although we're not seeing as large protests in individual locations, what we're seeing is more distributed engagement and activism. We're seeing more people participating, but they're not all descending on New York City. They're not all coming to DC like we used to see, even back in the first Trump administration. Instead, what we're seeing is people participating in their homes and in their communities. Or not in their homes, they're usually coming outside of their homes, but in their communities with their friends and neighbors, which is actually better for democracy. And I can tell you about that if you're interested in the question and answer. The resistance includes formal organizations and community-embedded networks like the ones that have been really getting a lot of attention in Minnesota, and they are being mobilized to protect neighbors and to push back. And finally, the movement will continue to expand in response to state-initiated violence. There is no evidence based on the data I've collected anywhere in the country that the people who are participating in collective action are actually interested in and planning to be violent. They will be peaceful, but just like during the civil rights movement, just like during many other moments of peaceful resistance, when violence is perpetrated against people who are engaging in peaceful, nonviolent activism, it escalates and then that can lead to violence. But it is usually, and so far there's lots of evidence that is being initiated by the state in terms of law enforcement. And finally, you may be asking this, so what can you do? This is an image from this week in Minnesota. We don't need a hero. In fact, what I would argue is that we really do not need like the individual to rise up above everybody else and tell everybody what to do. What we need is a movement, and we need a movement that's uniting all of us in our common struggle and lifts us all up together. Every one of us has a role to play, and it's not a one-size-fits-all type of a strategy where everybody has to do the same thing. But we all have the potential to be leaders and bridge builders as part of this movement, and we all need to figure out what role we're willing to play. What I would say, though, is that, I used to say it's going to take all of us doing anything we are comfortable with to save ourselves. And unfortunately, given what we're seeing, it's actually going to take us more than just what we're willing to do, but actually it's going to take us all doing whatever we can do, sometimes in an uncomfortable way, because it's going to take us all pushing back against the growing retrenchment that we're seeing in this country. So as unfair as it might seem, no one is coming to save us. We should not expect the Democratic Party to rise up all of a sudden and figure this out, because they've had over a year now. Some would argue they've had a lot more time than that. We have to be engaged and connected, and we need to work in solidarity with one another so we can work together to transform the retrenchment that we're seeing into democratic progress and democratic renewal, because that's really what we need right now. So we're all going to need to work together to save ourselves. Thank you very much. 30 minutes. So I guess I'm just going to take questions. Is that right? Apparently there's a microphone. Can you just introduce yourself when you talk, please?
Hello, good morning, and thank you so much. My name is Cecilia Adonis. I'm faculty here at SBS. I am so grateful for your talk, because any place of hope is always great. My question is, can you help us to better understand how distributed action versus more concentrated action, and how that movement in how we're participating has changed the implications of efficacy in terms of social movements?
That is a great question. Thank you. In fact, there's a whole section of American Resistance where I talk about the emergence of distributed organizing and the strength, potential, and also the challenges that it faces. So when we think about, and just so for everybody so we're all in the same place, so distributed action is action that is actually organized and coordinated in situ, if you will. So it's communities identify what are the needs, and then they work together to do whatever is necessary in their community, fitting the needs of their community. And in some cases, they coordinate, but they're all doing their own thing based on what's happening in each location. It's not concentrated, which, whereas like if you think back to the first Women's March in 2017, at that first Women's March, you could basically go on a Google Drive if you signed up, and you could download the flyer, you could download information, you could download the text that you send to all your friends about how you're going to the Women's March and what to do. It was very concentrated, it was centralized, it was coordinated, and then afterward there were specific asks. So that's this concentrated way of doing action. It's really, in a lot of ways, it's less democratic, right? Because what it tells the people who are participating is that they need to do what they're told to do. You could be the front line, you are soldiers in the war. But you're not there to think freely, and you're not there to think democratically. You're there to follow instructions to get where we need to go. And it can work, but I actually think that it's better when we meet people where they are and what they need in the communities. And that can be a community that is, a community that is more focused on like trying to communicate amongst a lot of neighbors who are all Trump supporters and are trying to ban books in a community, versus a community where everybody is, more left-leaning, but you really want to try to make sure that there are school vouchers or whatever. I'm just thinking about, like, there's a diversity, and our country is so different across it that the idea that there's like a one-stop answer. Last time around, the answer was, do you vote blue no matter who, right? It didn't work out so great. It worked out for a moment, but it wasn't lasting and durable change. Lasting, durable change comes from embedded action that is distributed. And the thing is that distributed action is much more tangible, it's much more organic, and it's realer, which is not really a word, but we'll just go with it. But it takes a lot more people, because you need people everywhere to do it themselves and then coordinate together. And it can be both distributed and concentrated by concentrating messages and tactics and coordinated efforts and timing. And that's the best way to do it. It takes a lot more work. You can't just put a post up on Instagram and be like, we're all going to do this, and you can download that, and then the change will come. You can't do it that way. But I don't think you can do it that way anyway, because we've seen a lot of examples of these types of concentrated asks, and they just don't yield fruit. Even if they yield fruit temporarily, it doesn't last.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Michael Barry. I'm a communications consultant with Princeton Creative. I have a little equation as well, and it's communication plus connection equals transformation, and that's kind of how I guide my work. Now, I would say that Trump according to George Will, is a bloviating ignoramus. However, I have to
I want to
argue.
mince words there. Just go ahead.
I love that phrase. I have to argue that he is a communicator, he makes connections, and he has created transformation. So my question is, and I agree with Jesse and you, that no one's coming to save us, but can we really do this without leadership? And we don't have any right now, because can't think of any examples in history where great movements have created the type of change that we need without leadership.
Well, I agree. I agree with the descriptions you have of our president. I mean, but he also, I mean, whether or not you support our president, the man is magical. I mean, he has an amazing amount of charisma. And in fact, as I've written in some of my books, like there's a political formula that involves a charismatic leader that can help to inspire and bring folks together in ways that otherwise you wouldn't see. And there's been some really interesting work that's come out recently about how Trump, before he ran for president the first time, basically went out and catered to Tea Party activists, because that was Tea Party was a big thing back then, and gun leaders and others who had felt like folks who were more conservative evangelical Christians, folks who felt like they had been left behind by the Republican Party, and was able to build bridges across these different, very disparate interest groups through his charismatic and communication style, which I'm sure he had folks working with him on it, but he was able to do that. So we definitely need that kind of connection. And so I'm not saying that we can have this distributed activism where there's this leaderless movement and we don't see anybody who helps to coordinate. What we need to see is leaders who emerge from these spaces where they're working. I mean, I would argue that Mamdani here presents an example of that here in New York City. Time is, we are young now still, but at least, certainly in terms of communication and channeling and communicating and inspiring folks to think about transformation, no question about that. The question is what comes next if leadership actually works. Usually when you're working in a movement, it's just all about speaking to potential and motivating and inspiring folks to work together and getting those disparate but hopefully distributed and community embedded folks to come out and see a leader who actually can connect their interests to interests of folks who are really different from them. And we're right, we do not see that now. And we need to see that, but I think that what we need to do is look at who is emerging in different parts of the country, leading the resistance that we're seeing in each different part of the country, and try to figure out how to bring them together. Unfortunately, in the social movement sector, we have seen, especially on the left, we have seen organizations that have competed for resources and support. And even though, like Leah and Ezra, when they started Indivisible and all the way through their work, have always talked about this many flowers bloom, beautiful approach, there still has been a competition around resources. It makes it very hard to find leaders who can bring people together if, you guys and I are fighting for the same very limited pot of money. So we have to figure that out. And, hopefully strategic communication and all of you in the room can help solve that problem because time is short.
Oh, hi, my name is Sophia Weissman. I'm a student in the Strategic Communications program. I found it really interesting that 79% of people agreed that these movements need to take more confrontational action. Although I guess sitting here wanting to take that confrontational action, but also seeing what's going on when Renee Good and Alex Preddy took that confrontational action and it ended up taking their lives because these ICE agents are deranged. That's to put it in the kindest way possible. So what is your recommendation on, because it feels like you need to take these confrontational actions to actually sustain this change, and I do agree with that. But for people sitting here that want to do that but also don't want to jeopardize their own life, what is your recommendation on still taking that confrontational action and standing firm in your position, but also, because just being peaceful and taking a video could risk your life at this point because these people are, again, deranged.
I like that word. I think it's a fair and nice G-rated word. So, so I've historically, so in Saving Ourselves, I talk about the need for taking advantage of violence against peaceful protesters as a way of expanding movements. And there's a lot of precedent, and actually I think this is in the piece that's coming out in The Guardian, but there's a precedent that shows that historically, when there's violence against activists, we actually see movements expanding. We're seeing it right now. We saw it after Renee was murdered, and then more recently since Alex was murdered. I mean, and in between that, there was this huge strike, and now there's going to be another national strike, right? I mean, we're seeing, it's like textbook what is said to happen. And in that moment, though, everybody's saying, I want to be confrontational, but I don't want to be like killed because I'm holding my phone up. And it's, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say fucking terrifying. It's terrifying. I apologize to anybody. I don't mean to hurt anybody's ears. But, it's terrifying. And it makes it very hard to be a person who's saying, history shows us that it is only when we are willing to go out in the streets, even with that risk. Think about the number of martyrs who risked their lives as part of the civil rights movement, and how many lives were lost, how many people were in jail. And people who, in periods of time during the civil rights movement, during the, farm workers' strikes, during periods of women's suffrage, they filled jails. And lots of those people were treated horribly, and people were murdered. And I am not belittling any of that, and I am not saying that anybody should do anything that puts your life at risk. But I think that is the unfortunate reality of social movements that actually affect change, especially when you're dealing with autocratic spaces like we're living in right now. I mean, I don't want to call it an autocratic state yet, because I'm just not there. I can't. But to push back to autocracy, it's going to take courage, it's going to take strength, it's going to take coordination, and unfortunately, I think it's going to take some martyrs. And I hope nobody in this room ends up being one of them, but yeah.
Hi, my name is Valentina Scarlata. I'm a student here as well in the program. My question is kind of going off of what has been said. I'm an international student, and there are many international students in my cohort. So my question would be, what kind of collective action can we have in a country where we're at risk if we actually take a stance? So I'm just trying to figure that out. Thank you.
That is a good question. I mean, I teach at the School of International Service, where we have like a third of our students haven't been able to get in the country to come. So it's a very big and interesting and depressing question to ask. I think, again, what I would advise everybody to do is work, and this is where like that distributed and community embeddedness is very helpful. Work within the communities. I mean, there are roles for people to play who are engaging in confrontational activism that do not put you on the front line. And that is a safer space. It's a safer space for people who are uncomfortable, for people who have a status that worries that maybe worry that they are going to end up being deported if they end up protesting and getting arrested. You can be lookout. You can provide health care. You can provide the social media, because somebody's got to be doing the social media for the folks who are actually on the front line so that the world is watching. Because if the world's not watching, bad things happen. And also, we need to be recording, because it's the person who tells the story. You all are strategic communicators. I don't need to tell you this. But if you are not telling your own story, then somebody else is telling your story however they want to, right? But those are all roles you can play where you don't have to do it on the front line. I mean, being those people who are bearing witness on the front line, like Alex Preddy was, that's very dangerous right now, and I would not suggest it unless you're okay with the repercussions of it. I mean, I think that just going back to this question here before, there's going to come a time, and I know. So one of my postdocs actually is in Minneapolis and actually lives around the corner from Renee Good's family, and her family has been involved in this community like mutual aid and mobilization. And there comes a time when everybody feels like you don't have any choice but to stand up. And there may be a time when you feel like that, even as an international student who's worried about your status. I think we're very lucky that in New York City, that time is not now. In Washington, D.C. this summer, we started thinking it was, and then the National Guard was pulled back. they will be back. I mean, they will be back, and they're going, they'll be everywhere if we don't stop them. So there are steps about what you're willing to do and when you're willing to do it. And so I just would say now, think about how you can support the people who have a safer situation. I mean, one of the reasons why we're seeing the Daughters of Joan Baez on the front lines is because they are taking advantage of their privilege and their history. And I have to say that, there are folks who are like, how dare all these older white women, stand up and be so loud? And it's like, well, first of all, come on, let's support women who are being loud. Women are allowed to be loud. In fact, sometimes it's necessary. But more importantly, I think the fact that women, and particularly these highly educated white women, are taking advantage of their privilege to be there and be willing to be out there in front is very valuable, because there are some people who are concerned about whether or not it's safe for them. People of color, people in communities of color, immigrant communities. And nobody should be putting themselves at too high a risk, even though risk is growing every day. So I think we should just applaud the Daughters of Joan Baez and everybody else. But figure out where you're comfortable for now, and do something for sure. Yes, hi.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Christopher Ranel. I'm a proud student of the SPS Columbia program. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your topics with us. I'm curious if there's any follow-up data. You speak about martyrs and people that are putting themselves in these scenarios, and I'm wondering about the collateral damage. I have friends and family that have engaged in protests in the past, and those that have like brain damage, rubber bullets, the real fallout that has occurred from putting themselves in these places with the intention and the essence of being nonviolent. I come from, I'm also a military veteran. That has also just given me breadth of experience. And I think about the people, I agree. I think there is a way to do things in a nonviolent way. Along with activation though, I wonder, there has to be preparation at length to take care of people that do put themselves in those scenarios. And I'm wondering, have you come across data, or do you have data about follow-up? You talk about activating resources. Are there plans? Are there insurances? Because when you meet someone who was just standing somewhere and has taken gas, has had concussions, has been held for 2 weeks without medical attention, and now they have issues, or you meet, when you do face these people. I lived on the West Coast, so I mean during the BLM movement, I'm wondering, have you found that people want to come forward to help with such things as insurances and medical help? Because I think along with the plan, yes, but preparation, preemptive preparation needs to be taken into consideration at length. And I wonder, how has that been for you ongoing in your data analysis?
That's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up, because it's absolutely part of the story that doesn't get told enough, right? I mean, and this is what I'll say. So I don't have actual data on people who are injured and what happens after that and how they get supported. But what I do have is I've been talking with a lot of the leaders of organizations, and so I just started this podcast. It's called the Apocalyptic Optimist Podcast. It's coming out next week. And the first episode is with the people who run the Women's March, who coordinated this Free America walkout, and that I was working with to collect these data that I showed it today. And so one of the things that Rachel Cremona said, she's the executive director there, during our conversation that I thought was really valuable, is she said, look, you see the data, people are ready to do this. They're going to get out there and things are going to get spicy. They're going to be disruptive in ways that are likely to motivate violence against them in some places. She said, but our job is to help train people so that they know what to expect and know what to do when the violence comes, and also to support them to recover. I mean, I was as part of a research project that's not about protests, I was out in California after the wildfires, and I was talking with young people who were involved in the Service Corps programs that were doing cleanup after the wildfires. And it was right after the National Guard was there, so I thought, ooh, I can bring together two of my different research projects. So I decided, my last question was like, I don't know if any of you have been in protests, and tell me about this. And this was a group of young people who were like 18 to 23, all Latino. Many of them were not, were in college but hadn't graduated, or were people who had graduated from college and couldn't get jobs, and so were working as Service Corps members. And first they were like, oh, no, we're not involved in that. And then we started talking about it, and they're like, oh, but my sister got shot by a rubber bullet. I have a friend who got hit in the eye, and he's in hospital. He's going to lose the eye. He may have brain damage. And the stories around the room were just horrifying. And the question was, what happens to those people? And that's exactly the question that, at least from the conversations I've been having with folks who run like Women's March and ACLU and, Indivisible, they're starting to think about how not only to train people to participate safely in peaceful resistance that's nonviolent but maybe involves civil disobedience, but also to be able to have the resources and support to help people when this happens. But I don't know of data on that, and there should be. So I think you should keep pressing. I mean, I can help you to think about folks maybe to go to, but I have not seen data on that. In fact, even during the period of the civil rights movement, there were these like case studies, and there's this great, the Southern Law Center has actually like a timeline of martyrs, but they basically have them as these like stories and anecdotes rather than like thinking about support and networks and all of that, which needs to happen. Thank you. Are we out of time? We're out of time. Thank you all so much.